They found the report in a rust-colored archive box, misfiled under routine communications failures. A single note on the cover page, typed in a hurry during the final months of World War II, asked one question that no one ever answered. Why did the strike never fall? The story that followed would remain buried for decades, dismissed as an operational glitch, an unremarkable footnote in the machinery of the Second World War. But behind the static, behind the broken circuitry and jammed relays, was a moment in which an entire city balanced on the thin edge of annihilation, and survived only because one radio failed to do what it was built to do. It began in the cramped interior of a forward communications hut, where a young radio operator worked under the low glow of a single lamp. His hands moved with practiced precision across the steel knobs and frequency wheels. Every message he received fed into the vast network of Allied intelligence, bombing plans, troop movements, reconnaissance updates. On that cold morning in 1944, he calibrated the set as usual, unaware that a hairline crack had formed across the central transformer panel during the night. The equipment looked intact, but deep inside the voltage was misbehaving, warping the outgoing frequencies by fractions of a second that no human could detect. He logged the calibration as successful. The war continued its usual rhythm of coded messages and quiet urgency. Across the channel, a briefing room buzzed with tension. Aerial reconnaissance had reported a concentration of enemy materiel in a key metropolitan sector. Factory lines, supply depots, rail junctions vital to the German war machine. The Allied High Command considered it a legitimate military target. They convened pilots, navigators, and squadron leaders for a strike that would unfold with cold precision. Maps unfurled across tables, chalk-marked flight paths. Timers were synchronized. Outside, crews primed engines under a rising sun that washed the airfield in white glare. No one questioned the intelligence. The photographs were convincing, the supply traffic undeniable. A city already battered by years of conflict was about to face the heaviest raid it had ever seen. When the crews stepped toward their aircraft, the only sound louder than the engines was the hiss of radio interference that had begun creeping across one of the command frequencies. It was faint at first, a thin, irregular static that operators chalked up to bad weather over the channel. The war was full of such interruptions: sunspots, poor grounding, disrupted cables. No one suspected that this static wasn't atmospheric at all, but the first symptom of the cracked transmitter coil hundreds of miles away. The radio officer monitoring the strike authorization channel tapped the casing with his knuckles. The distortion flickered, steadied, then returned even harsher. He cursed under his breath and continued scanning for the confirmation code that would unleash the mission. Meanwhile, the ground crews stood ready, waiting for the final sequence of orders that always arrived with clock-like discipline. Silence stretched longer than usual. Some assumed a delay in weather assessment. Others saw it as a sign that the operation might be pushed by an hour. But inside each cockpit, pilots sat strapped in, listening to the static-laced channel that should have carried the most important message of the day: the execute command. Above the gathering clouds, the crews could already picture the target below them. They had flown over similar skylines hundreds of times. Industrial smoke rising from shattered districts, rail yards pitted by past strikes, empty streets where civilians had long since fled underground or westward. A cityscape from a bomber's window was a place stripped of human detail, reduced to lines, shadows, and coordinates. None of them knew that under one of those coordinates lived nearly 200,000 civilians who were not supposed to be in the blast zone at all. Inside the command center, tasked with green-lighting the operation, confusion was blooming. The authorization message sent 5 minutes earlier had not been acknowledged. A second attempt was made. Same channel, same code. No reply. Operators switched frequencies, puzzled at the silence from the remote relay unit responsible for transferring the final confirmation to the bomber group. It had always worked without fail. Today, the signal vanished into static. The critical relay station was the same hut where the young operator had started his morning. By now, the crack in the transformer plate had deepened from heat. The outgoing signal warped, dispersed, and then dissolved entirely. To the crews in the air, it sounded like nothing more than a faint broken whisper under 1,000 layers of interference. To the command center, it sounded like the bomber group had acknowledged because their own equipment registered an incoming tone, distorted, incomplete, but close enough to a confirmation to be mistaken for one. Two parts of a single system now believed opposite things. This was the kind of technological misalignment that wartime engineers feared most. Below, mechanics attempted to replace the failing component. They stripped the casing, tested the circuits, tried to force the transformer back into coherence. The operator watched the readings fluctuate dangerously. He didn't know that the message he had just failed to transmit was the final authorization to begin bombing runs over a heavily populated district that Allied intelligence had wrongly assessed as evacuated. He didn't know that a messenger on horseback, sent as a redundant failsafe, was delayed by enemy patrols and muddy roads, unable to deliver the printed authorization that would bypass the broken radio entirely. Minutes bled into each other. In the air, the bomber crews waited as long as their fuel allowed. They followed protocol. No final authorization, no attack. The formation began peeling off one by one, turning back toward base, frustrated but obedient. Engines throbbed under the weight of bombs that never fell. Had the message reached them, they would have carried out the order without hesitation. No one doubted the intelligence. No one suspected a catastrophic misunderstanding in the target assessment. As the strike force returned to base, the city below carried on with the rhythm of wartime survival. Civilians lined up for bread, children collected firewood, families tended to small gardens carved into ruined courtyards. They had no idea that, according to Allied planners, this very district had been marked non-residential and critical to Axis logistics. The error had emerged when outdated reconnaissance images were mixed with newer ones, creating a false impression that the eastern quarter had been abandoned. In truth, thousands of civilians had returned once bombardments in surrounding regions stopped. Their presence never appeared in the intelligence summaries. Back at the airfield, the failure to execute the mission triggered a wave of anger and bewilderment. Logs were pulled. Officers demanded explanations. Someone blamed the relay station. Someone else blamed an inexperienced operator. The cracked component was placed on a table and photographed for the technical report. Engineers insisted it was a fluke. Commanders continued debating whether the mission should be relaunched before nightfall. But by the time they revisited the intelligence data, one analyst noticed inconsistencies. Civilian activity markers were visible in the latest aerial shots. Laundry lines, rooftop heat signatures, market traffic near the supposed industrial hub. The mission was quietly canceled. No broadcast explained why. No medals were awarded. The operator whose equipment failed was never told what he had prevented. But the skyline over that city remained intact. Smoke did not rise from its eastern quarter. The small details of daily life, shops reopening, bells ringing, families gathering at dusk, continued because the radio meant to authorize their destruction had fallen into silence. In the years after World War II, intelligence officers revisited the incident while compiling declassified communications failures. One set of handwritten notes pointed out the strange alignment of errors. A cracked transformer, a messenger delayed by patrols, a misread acknowledgement signal, and a late-discovered intelligence mistake that would have turned a routine military strike into a humanitarian disaster. Historians later called it a statistical impossibility that all of these failures aligned in the same hour. But to those who lived in the city that never burned, it was something else entirely. In the months that followed the aborted mission, the incident remained buried under layers of operational paperwork. The Second World War had little patience for mysteries that didn't directly affect the outcome of a campaign. And this one, an aborted raid, a faulty radio, a misaligned intelligence packet, seemed insignificant compared to the titanic battles unfolding across Europe. Yet inside Allied intelligence circles, the aftershocks lingered. If an attack could be halted accidentally, it meant a deeper vulnerability existed, one that could just as easily lead to unintended devastation. Analysts began reconstructing the full chain of events, starting with the fractured transformer that had sabotaged the relay station. The device was tested repeatedly. It produced unpredictable distortions, the kind that could mimic short confirmations or scramble outgoing messages without fully breaking the signal. Engineers diagrammed how the crack might have formed: thermal stress overnight, a manufacturing defect, or even vibrations from nearby artillery practice. They couldn't agree. The more tests they ran, the more erratic the coil's behavior became. It was impossible to replicate the exact distortion that had fooled the bomber command. The component was eventually retired to a technical archive, tagged as an anomaly. But the intelligence division was more troubled by the discovery that their target assessment had been wrong. The aerial photos of the district in question told a fragmented story. Older images showed a ravaged industrial zone with collapsed warehouses and empty streets. Newer reconnaissance passed over the area only briefly, capturing random glimpses of activity but never enough to confirm large-scale habitation. When analysts re-examined them after the failed mission, the truth became clear. People had returned. Windows were repaired. Makeshift gardens had appeared. Civilians had found life among ruins that Allied planners assumed were still abandoned. What had been marked as a logistics hub was in fact a district slowly rebuilding itself after months of evacuation and uncertainty. Commanders reviewing the revised assessment understood the gravity of what nearly happened. The strike would not have crippled enemy supply lines as intended. It would have caused mass civilian casualties and destroyed a part of the city that was finally beginning to breathe again. A single flawed intelligence summary combined with an over-reliance on outdated photographs had nearly turned a military operation into a humanitarian catastrophe. And the only reason the mistake didn't become part of World War II's long list of tragic miscalculations was because a cracked relay coil failed at precisely the right moment. Meanwhile, the bomber crews returned to routine missions. Officially, the aborted operation was attributed to technical communications failure, nothing more. Pilots spoke among themselves about the odd silence from command that day, the sensation of waiting for a signal that never came. One navigator later recalled the eerie moment when the formation hovered in place above the cloud layer, engines idling, as though the war itself had paused. None of them knew how close they came to unleashing devastation on a city that had no idea it was in danger. On the ground, in the city whose survival depended on silence, life continued with wartime unease but without the smoke that would have engulfed the eastern quarter had the bombers released their payloads. In the evenings, families lit candles in cellars, unaware that Allied High Command had once drawn a circle around their district and labeled it a military target. Farmers carried produce into markets. Workers repaired water pipelines damaged months earlier. Children played near courtyards cleared of rubble. Their normalcy would have vanished in seconds had the confirmation code reached the bomber group. The messenger dispatched as a failsafe finally reached the relay post long after the crews had already returned. His horse was exhausted. His uniform was muddy from taking back roads to avoid patrols. He handed over a sealed envelope carrying the printed authorization, the one thing that could have overridden the faulty radio. It was useless now, a document from an operation that had evaporated before it began. Years later, the envelope was found in an archive binder with a note, "Arrived too late to matter." What puzzled investigators most was the false acknowledgement tone that the command center believed came from the bomber group. Communications officers swore the signal was unmistakably a confirmation. But when they reconstructed the waveform, it showed irregularities consistent with the damaged relay coil. In other words, the system had generated an acknowledgement from a frequency distortion, not from any human operator. Machines had spoken for men, and in doing so, prevented men from acting. Some intelligence officers quietly argued that the event demonstrated the fragility of wartime technology, that even in the age of radio coordination, a single machine failure could skew the trajectory of an entire mission. Others claimed it exposed procedural weaknesses, too much reliance on one communication relay, not enough redundancy, no real-time verification. But a small handful of analysts reviewing the civilian data believed something more unsettling. The mission never should have been approved in the first place. It was the intelligence error, not the broken radio, that posed the true threat. The malfunction merely exposed it in time. In the chaos of World War II, where cities were wiped from maps and entire regions burned under the weight of strategic doctrine, the survival of one district because of a faulty piece of equipment might seem insignificant. Yet as the war neared its end, and the scale of destruction across Europe became fully visible, the story gained renewed weight. When declassification teams sifted through communications logs in the 1950s, the incident stood out as a rare alignment of human error, mechanical failure, and unintended mercy. By then, the city had rebuilt. Its skyline rose stronger than before. Factories reopened. Rail lines hummed again. Civilians returned to their pre-war routines, slowly at first, then with the confidence of people who had survived the worst. Few knew that at a certain hour in 1944, their fate had turned on the malfunction of a single radio relay. Fewer still knew that intelligence analysts had nearly condemned their district to destruction because of a faulty assumption buried in a stack of reconnaissance summaries. In official histories of the Second World War, the incident barely appears, a passing reference to a failed communications relay during pre-strike authorization. But in the shaded margins of declassified intelligence notes, it reads differently. It carries the weight of a near tragedy avoided not by strategy, bravery, or deliberate restraint, but by coincidence, fragility, and the unpredictable behavior of wartime machines. The cracked transformer, the delayed messenger, the misinterpreted signal, each alone was unremarkable. Together they formed a chain strong enough to hold back the machinery of modern warfare for just long enough to save a city. When historians look back on the chaotic final years of World War II, they often point to technology as the force that accelerated destruction. But this story reveals the opposite. At least once, technology's failure granted a moment of unexpected preservation. The war would continue, battles would rage, fronts would shift, and cities elsewhere would not be as fortunate. Yet the skyline that should have disappeared under a wave of Allied explosives remained intact. Not because generals changed their minds, not because diplomacy intervened, but because a single radio, cracked and failing, refused to deliver the command that would have erased a part of the world forever. In the decades after the Second World War, veterans who served in that bomber group sometimes wondered why that day felt different, why the sky above the target city seemed strangely still. why the radios carried only static, why the war's relentless tempo broke for a few quiet minutes. None of them imagined that the silence had been the final barrier between life and destruction. The legacy of World War II is heavy with lessons about strategy, intelligence, and the limits of human control. But this forgotten episode offers another truth. Sometimes the thin line between ruin and survival is drawn not by decisions in war rooms but by imperfections in the machines we trust. A broken radio, a skewed frequency, a moment of static. These became the unlikely guardians of a city that history nearly erased. Long after the documents were declassified, one archivist summarized the incident in a single stark sentence that never made it into official reports. The city was saved because the machine failed,